The rain against the tall windows of Harrington Manor did not sound like a greeting. It sounded like a warning. Lady Eleanor Vance stood in the center of the grand entry hall, the hem of her plain gray traveling dress damp and heavy with mud. She did not shiver, though the ancient stone walls radiated a deep, unforgiving chill. She kept her hands folded over her stomach, her fingers gripping the fabric of her skirt with a silent, rigid tension. Before her stood her new family. Dowager Duchess Beatrice sat in a high-backed velvet chair near the unlit hearth, wearing a heavy purple silk gown that rustled like dry leaves every time she shifted. She held a tortoiseshell fan, tapping it rhythmically against her palm. Beside her stood Julian, the Duke of Harrington. He was impeccably dressed in a black frock coat, his posture as stiff as the marble pillars holding up the ceiling. He did not look at his bride. Instead, he pulled a gold pocket watch from his waistcoat, checked the time with a faint frown, and snapped it shut. The sharp click of the watch echoed in the cavernous hall. It was the only sound besides the rain. 50 servants were lined up along the walls. They stood in absolute silence, watching the new Duchess drip water onto the ancient flagstones. Eleanor kept her wide-set hazel eyes steady, refusing to look at the floor. "She is entirely too thin," the Dowager said, her voice carrying easily across the space, "and her posture is atrocious. One would think, Julian, that a baron facing bankruptcy would have at least taught his daughter how to stand like a lady before selling her to a duke." Eleanor's breath hitched, a tiny, fractured movement in her chest, but her face remained smooth. A porcelain mask. "Mother," Julian said. It was not a defense. It was merely a request for brevity. He finally looked at Eleanor. His deep-set gray eyes held no warmth, no curiosity, not even the basic human courtesy one might offer a stranger seeking shelter. He looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. He stepped forward. "We do not expect much from you, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice clipped and precise. "This marriage was a transaction. Your father required his debts erased. I require an heir and a household that runs without causing me the slightest inconvenience. You are here to fulfill a function, nothing more." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, a desperate instinct to defend her father's name, but the Dowager snapped her tortoiseshell fan open with a sound like a cracking whip. "You do not speak unless spoken to," the Dowager commanded. She gestured to the head butler, who stepped forward carrying a silver tray. On the tray rested a thick, leather-bound book. "This is the Rulebook of Harrington Manor," Julian said, watching Eleanor's pale face. "It details everything expected of the Duchess: when you will wake, what you will wear, how you will manage the menus, the linens, and the staff. You will not concern yourself with the estate's finances, nor will you question my mother's authority. A duchess must obey. You will follow every rule in this book, and in return, you will enjoy the privilege of my name." Eleanor looked at the heavy leather book. She looked at the smirking Dowager. She looked at the husband who had just erased her humanity in front of 50 strangers. "Do you understand your place?" Julian demanded, his voice hardening, unused to waiting for a response. "I expect absolute compliance. I expect you to manage this house flawlessly and silently." Eleanor slowly reached out and took the book from the silver tray. The leather was cold. Her fingers were trembling, but she forced them to go still. She looked directly into Julian's eyes. She did not cry. She did not argue. The terrified, hopeful girl who had stepped out of the carriage minutes ago died quietly on the cold stone floor. She lowered her head in a perfect, shallow nod. She did not say a word. "Good," Julian said, turning his back on her, already bored. "See that she is shown to her rooms. I have business in the library." As the Duke walked away and the Dowager laughed softly to her maid, Eleanor stood alone in the center of the hall. She held the rulebook against her chest. Manage the house flawlessly and silently. It was a command meant to break her, but as she touched the heavy binding, a strange, freezing calm washed over her. If they wanted a perfect, silent administrator, she would give them exactly that. And she would follow their rules until those very rules destroyed them. The silence of Lady Eleanor Vance was not a passive thing. It was an architecture. For the first 30 days of her marriage, she did not speak a single word to her husband, nor to his mother. She did not pout. She did not weep in the corridors. She simply vanished from their emotional landscape, leaving behind a highly efficient, perfectly polite ghost. Julian had demanded a flawless administrator. He had demanded compliance. Eleanor gave him exactly what he asked for, and he was beginning to discover how terrifying that could be. At the breakfast table on a cold Tuesday morning, the silence was heavy enough to crack the porcelain teacups. Julian sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a dark wool suit, his gold pocket watch resting beside his plate. The Dowager Duchess sat to his right, picking at a plate of eggs. Eleanor sat at the opposite end, wearing another of her high-collared, unremarkable gray dresses. "The tea is entirely too bitter today," the Dowager complained loudly, glaring down the length of the table. "I explicitly told the kitchen that my morning blend requires a lighter steep, but of course one cannot expect proper supervision in this house anymore." Julian looked up, his jaw tight. He expected Eleanor to flinch. He expected her to stammer an apology or desperately defend herself. Instead, Eleanor calmly set down her silver spoon. She did not look at the Dowager. She did not look at Julian. She raised her hand a fraction of an inch, catching the eye of the footman standing by the sideboard. With 2 precise flicks of her fingers, she signaled for the teapot to be removed and a fresh brew to be brought from the kitchen. It was done in 10 seconds. She picked up her spoon and resumed eating, her pale face completely serene. Julian stared at her, his chest tightened with an irritating, unnameable frustration. He had wanted obedience, but this absolute machine-like compliance felt dangerously like contempt. He reached for his pocket watch, tracing the engraved gold surface, waiting for her to break the silence. She did not. When breakfast concluded, Eleanor rose, offered a single shallow nod to the empty air between Julian and his mother, and glided from the room. Her destination was the butler's pantry. According to page 14 of the rulebook Julian had forced upon her, the Duchess was required to inspect the household inventories on the 1st of the month. To do so, she required access. Mr. Hess, the aging head butler, stood at attention as Eleanor entered. "Good morning, Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Hess," Eleanor replied. Her voice was soft, warm, and perfectly modulated, a stark contrast to the freezing silence she served the Duke. "I require the master ring of keys for the estate." Mr. Hess hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "The Dowager Duchess usually holds the keys, Your Grace." Eleanor placed the leather-bound rulebook on the wooden counter. "The Duke's rules state that the acting Duchess must oversee the inventories. I cannot oversee what I cannot open. The keys, please." The butler, recognizing an unmovable force when he saw one, unlocked a small glass cabinet and handed over a heavy iron ring. Eleanor's eyes scanned the collection of brass and iron. Near the center, hanging on a slightly frayed leather cord, was a silver skeleton key. It was older than the rest, its teeth worn smooth. "What does this open, Mr. Hess?" she asked, touching the cold silver. "The basement archives, Your Grace," he murmured. "Though the Dowager ordered it locked 5 years ago, no one goes down there. It is only old ledgers and estate records." "I see. Thank you." 10 minutes later, Eleanor descended the narrow stone steps beneath the kitchens. The air grew damp and smelled of old paper and cold earth. At the bottom of the stairs stood a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. She slipped the silver key into the lock. It turned with a harsh, groaning click. She pushed the door open. The archive room was vast, windowless, and freezing. Thick layers of dust covered rows of wooden shelves lined with green and black leather-bound ledgers. To anyone else, it would look like a graveyard of useless paper. But to Eleanor, daughter of a ruined baron who had spent her teenage years secretly keeping her father's creditors at bay through sheer mathematical brilliance. It looked like a battlefield. She set her oil lamp on a cracked wooden table. She pulled down a ledger marked with the previous year's date. She opened it, brushing the dust from the pages. Her eyes began to scan the columns of ink. She traced the numbers with her pale fingers. Maintenance costs, charitable donations, allowances. Within 20 minutes, the pattern emerged. It was subtle, masked by clever accounting, but Eleanor's mind was built for numbers. Money was bleeding from the Harrington estate. Huge, sweeping sums were being funneled into dummy accounts and over-invoiced repair projects, and every single discrepancy bore the authorized seal of Dowager Duchess Beatrice. Eleanor closed the ledger. In the dim, freezing light of the archives, her lips curved into a very faint, terrifying smile. She slipped the silver skeleton key off the heavy iron ring and threaded it onto a thin ribbon, tying it securely around her neck, hidden safely beneath the high collar of her gray dress. They wanted her to manage the house flawlessly. She was going to manage it to the very last penny. 6 months passed. The silence did not break. It calcified. Harrington Manor had never been managed with such terrifying precision. The silver was polished until it looked like dark water. The fires in the drawing rooms were lit exactly 10 minutes before anyone entered. The household staff, once prone to gossip and laziness under the dowager's erratic rule, now moved through the stone corridors with hushed, absolute reverence for the quiet woman in the gray dress. Eleanor followed every mandate in the leather-bound rulebook. She was the flawless administrator Julian had demanded, and Julian was beginning to realize that living with a machine was its own kind of hell. It was late afternoon when Eleanor entered the Duke's study to deliver the weekly household accounts. The heavy mahogany door was open. Julian sat behind his massive desk, a pen resting loosely in his hand. He watched her walk in. She did not look at him. She walked directly to the edge of the desk, placed the neatly tallied ledger precisely on the corner, and turned to leave. "Eleanor," Julian said. She stopped. She did not turn around. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. The rulebook dictated she must not ignore a direct summons, but it did not dictate she had to reply. Julian stared at her rigid spine. His chest felt uncomfortably tight. He had spent his entire life building walls of authority to keep people at a distance, and now his wife had built one out of thin air that he could not breach. "The accounts are entirely in order," he said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration he could not completely hide. "In fact, household expenditures are down by 20%. You have done remarkably well." He waited. He expected a softening of her shoulders, a polite thank you, a glance backward. Eleanor offered a single shallow nod to the bookshelf in front of her. Then she stepped forward and walked out of the room, her gray skirts making no sound on the rugs. Julian picked up his gold pocket watch, his knuckles white as he gripped the metal. He opened it, stared at the ticking hands, and slammed it shut. He had demanded her silence. He could not punish her for obeying him. But while the Duke paced in his study above, the Duchess was fighting a war in the dark. At midnight, long after the house had fallen asleep, Eleanor sat in the freezing basement archives. A single oil lamp cast long, trembling shadows across the stone walls. Beneath the high collar of her dress, the silver skeleton key rested against her collarbone, a cold, heavy anchor. She was deep into the ledger of 1823. Her ink-stained fingers moved rapidly down a column of numbers. The Dowager Duchess Beatrice had not just been skimming from the household budget. She had been hemorrhaging the estate's wealth. Eleanor cross-referenced a requisition for roof repairs on the West Wing, with a bank draft from the same week. The West Wing had not seen its stonemason in a decade. The money, over £4,000, had been transferred directly to an account in London belonging to Lord Arthur, the Dowager's notoriously gambling-addicted nephew. There were dozens of these entries, phantom repairs, exorbitant stipends for non-existent staff, charitable donations to foundations that Eleanor's sharp memory recognized as holding companies. The Dowager was stealing Harrington Manor blind, and Julian was too arrogant to check his own mother's math. The sound of footsteps on the stairs above made Eleanor pause. She smoothly closed the ledger and blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. She sat in the pitch black, her breathing shallow and controlled, until the footsteps faded away. The next morning, the Dowager Beatrice cornered Eleanor in the drawing room. "I am hosting a dinner party next month," the Dowager announced, snapping her tortoiseshell fan. 50 guests, the elite of the county. I expect a 10-course menu, imported French wines, and new silk draperies for the dining hall. The requisition form is on the table. Sign it." The Dowager smiled a cruel, knowing smile. It was an exorbitant demand, designed entirely to remind Eleanor of her place, to force her to authorize wealth she could never possess. Eleanor looked at the older woman. Her wide-set hazel eyes were completely unreadable. She walked to the table, picked up the pen, and signed her name at the bottom of the requisition in a flowing, perfectly steady hand. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply handed the paper back to the Dowager, turned, and walked away. Let the old woman buy her French wine. Let her order her silk drapes. Eleanor needed the Dowager to feel invincible, because an invincible enemy never looks down to see the trap closing around their ankles. The grand dining room of Harrington Manor had not seen such blinding opulence in a decade. 3 massive crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, casting warm light over the new crimson silk drapery that framed the tall windows. 50 guests, representing the oldest and wealthiest families in the county, sat along the sweeping length of the polished mahogany table. At the head of the table sat the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, wrapped in her heavy purple silk, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She was in her element, snapping her tortoiseshell fan to punctuate her anecdotes, holding the attention of the local lords and ladies with practiced ease. At the opposite end of the table sat Julian, nursing a glass of imported Bordeaux. He looked impeccably sharp in his evening clothes, but beneath the edge of the tablecloth his thumb nervously traced the engraved casing of his gold pocket watch. And seated quietly to Julian's right, looking like a shadow that had accidentally fallen across a feast, was Eleanor. She wore a high-collared, unadorned, charcoal gray gown. The rulebook dictated that the Duchess must be present at all formal functions, but it did not stipulate that she must sparkle, so she did not. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, her pale hands resting gracefully on either side of her silver plate. Against her collarbone, hidden beneath the heavy silk of her bodice, the silver skeleton key felt pleasantly cold. "It is a tragedy of modern times," the Dowager said loudly, leaning across the table toward a visiting earl. "The blurring of the classes. One used to marry for lineage, for breeding. Now, it seems, titles are traded like debts at a fish market." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter echoed around the Dowager's end of the table. Several guests cast sideways glances at Eleanor. Everyone in the room knew her father was a ruined baron. Everyone knew she had been bought. Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at Eleanor, expecting her to lower her head in shame, or perhaps excuse herself in tears. He almost wanted her to. If she showed pain, he could intervene. He could act to protect her. But Eleanor did not blink. Her wide-set hazel eyes remained fixed on the center of the table. She reached for her water glass, her hand perfectly steady. She was not listening to the insults. She was doing math. 50 guests, she calculated silently, watching the footman pour the wine. 3 bottles of the 1815 Bordeaux per 10 guests. 15 bottles in total. The Dowager's requisition claimed £50 for the wine. The true market cost is closer to 20. "I did suggest she hire a tutor in conversation," the Dowager continued, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But I suppose when one is raised in a cottage, the art of dinner discourse is somewhat neglected." The crimson silk drapes, Eleanor's mind worked flawlessly, ignoring the stinging words. invoiced at £200 through a merchant in London. But the stitching is uneven on the hems. Local fabrication. Cost no more than £40. The remaining £160 diverted to Lord Arthur's gambling debts. Eleanor, Julian said softly, his voice barely carrying over the chatter. She did not turn her head. She did not look at him. She merely raised her hand, extending 2 fingers toward a passing footman. The servant immediately stepped forward and refilled Julian's wine glass. She had anticipated his need without acknowledging his existence. Julian stared at his full glass, a sudden sickening knot forming in his stomach. He was watching his mother verbally flay his wife in front of half the county, and his wife was behaving exactly as he had ordered her to on their wedding day, managing the house flawlessly and silently. He had built this cage. He could not be angry that she fit inside it so perfectly. Duchess, Lord Hastings, a pompous ally of the Dowager, called out from down the table. "Tell us, what do you make of the new agricultural tariffs?" The room fell quiet. It was a trap, designed to humiliate her, to expose her supposed ignorance. Eleanor looked at Lord Hastings. Her face was a mask of expensive, terrifying calm. The rulebook stated she must not engage in political or financial discourse. A duchess must obey. She held his gaze for 5 agonizingly long seconds. The silence in the room stretched, pulling tighter and tighter until it felt as though the crystal goblets might shatter. Then, with slow, deliberate grace, she looked to the head butler and gave a single nod. The dining room doors opened, and the servants marched in with the next course, smoothly interrupting the silence. Eleanor picked up her silver fork. Julian exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at his wife's pale profile, realizing with a cold shock that she was not a victim enduring a beating. She was a general, quietly mapping a battlefield. And as the Dowager laughed at her own cruelty, Eleanor calculated the final sum in her head, adding it to the long, damning ledger locked in the dark below. The transfer of power in Harrington Manor did not happen with a shouted argument or a slammed door. It happened with a silver letter opener and a stick of red sealing wax. It was a damp Tuesday morning, the estate wrapped in a suffocating gray fog. Eleanor stood in the quiet morning room, dressed in a high-collared slate-gray gown that made her look like an extension of the stone walls. She was waiting by the polished oak table when Mr. Hess, the head butler, entered with the Morning Post on a silver tray. Before he could turn toward the Dowager's private sitting room, Eleanor extended her pale hand. "The Post, Mr. Hess," she said softly. The butler paused, his eyes flicking to the thick, wax-sealed envelope sitting on top of the pile. They bore the crest of the Royal Bank of London. "The Dowager Duchess usually reviews the bank correspondence, Your Grace." Eleanor did not blink. She simply rested her fingertips on the leather-bound rulebook that she now carried with her everywhere. "Page 42, Mr. Hess. The acting Duchess oversees all incoming estate correspondence to ensure proper filing. I am certain the Duke would not wish for us to violate his own written mandates." Mr. Hess looked at the quiet, unyielding woman in front of him. He bowed his head and lowered the tray. Eleanor smoothly slid the bank envelopes into her pocket. She turned around and found Julian standing in the doorway. He had been watching her. He wore his impeccable black coat, but the rigid posture he usually maintained was showing microscopic signs of strain. His hand hovered near his waistcoat pocket, his fingers twitching with the urge to reach for his gold watch. Mr. Hess bowed hastily and retreated, leaving the Duke and Duchess alone in the heavy silence of the morning room. Julian stepped forward. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a frozen ocean. He looked at her pale face, searching for a trace of the nervous, hopeful girl he had married 7 months ago. There was nothing, just smooth, expensive ice. "My mother prefers to handle the London letters herself," Julian said, his voice low, testing the boundary. Eleanor offered a shallow nod, acknowledging that she had heard the statement, but she made no move to surrender the envelopes. She turned back toward the table and began arranging the remaining calling cards in a perfectly symmetrical line. Julian's chest tightened. The silence, which he had once demanded as a sign of respect, was now suffocating him. He watched her hands move, so precise, so devoid of affection or hesitation. She was treating him exactly as he had asked to be treated, as a master to be obeyed, not a man to be loved. "Stop," Julian said. Eleanor's hand paused in the air. She did not look at him. "I said stop," Julian repeated, stepping closer. The frustration in his voice cracked, bleeding into something that sounded dangerously like desperation. "Look at me, Eleanor." She slowly turned her head. Her wide-set hazel eyes met his. They were calm, clear, and utterly empty of emotion. "Speak to me," Julian demanded, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I am standing in my own house, speaking to my own wife, and I feel as though I am talking to a ghost. I commanded you to run this house, yes, but I am asking you now, what are you doing? What is in those letters? Tell me what you are thinking." He waited. His heart struck against his ribs with heavy, uneven thuds. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Eleanor looked at his desperate, angry face. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the edge of the bank envelope, and then resting lightly against the silver skeleton key hidden beneath her collar. £4,216 and 4 shillings, Eleanor said. Her voice was like a blade drawn across glass, cold, flawless, devastating. Julian froze, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What? What are you talking about?" Eleanor did not elaborate. She did not raise her voice, nor did she show a single flicker of anger. She merely offered him another perfect, shallow nod, stepped around him without brushing his coat, and walked quietly out of the room. Julian was left standing alone in the morning room, the ticking of his pocket watch suddenly sounding like a countdown to an explosion he could not see. The number haunted Julian, £4,216 and 4 shillings. He sat in his study late into the night, the fire dying in the hearth, frantically flipping through the green leather ledgers kept on his desk. He searched for the sum. He calculated columns, traced expenditures, and rubbed his aching eyes until the dawn light bled through the windows. He found nothing. The official books were flawless. He pulled out his gold pocket watch, the cold metal heavy in his palm. The rhythmic ticking felt like a hammer against his skull. His wife knew something. The quiet, obedient woman in the gray dress held a secret that was slowly driving him mad, and the absolute wall of her silence prevented him from demanding the truth. He was the Duke of Harrington, yet he felt entirely powerless in his own home. The annual estate audit was scheduled for Thursday. It was usually a tedious, polite affair. The men from the Royal Bank of London would arrive, drink his brandy, glance over the summaries, and leave. But this year, the air in the manor felt thin and electric. On Tuesday afternoon, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice summoned Eleanor to the drawing room. The older woman was pacing before the fireplace, her tortoiseshell fan snapping with irritated energy. Eleanor entered silently, her slate-gray skirts brushing the carpet. She stood with her hands folded, waiting. "The auditors arrive in 2 days," the Dowager said briskly, dropping a thick stack of parchment onto the polished table. "I require your signature on the final quarterly requisitions, winter preparations for the estate, charitable endowments, and a few minor refurbishments for the East Wing." Eleanor stepped forward and looked at the top sheet. The total was staggering, £3,000. It was a brazen, reckless theft, hurried through before the bank could close the year's books. The Dowager was growing greedy, emboldened by a year of Eleanor's perfect, unquestioning compliance. "Sign it," the Dowager commanded, tapping the paper with her fan. "And do not dawdle. The courier is waiting to take it to the bank's local branch." Eleanor did not argue. She picked up the heavy brass pen. She dipped it into the inkwell. But before the nib touched the paper, she paused. She opened the leather-bound rulebook she carried with her, turning precisely to page 87. According to the estate bylaws, Eleanor said, her voice a soft, flat murmur, all final quarter drafts exceeding £1,000 must be bound directly to the master ledger for the auditor's physical inspection, rather than sent by courier. The dowager sneered, rolling her eyes at the rigid obedience. Fine, bind it to the ledger, put it in the main folio for Thursday. Just sign the wretched thing, Eleanor. I swear your obsession with that little book makes you more of a clerk than a duchess. Eleanor's expression did not change. She signed her name with a smooth, flowing stroke. By telling Eleanor to bind it to the master folio for the auditors, the dowager had just legally authorized the bank to inspect the specific routing numbers of the draft, numbers that Eleanor knew perfectly well led straight to Lord Arthur's gambling debts. The trap was set. The steel jaws were open, and the dowager had just gleefully stepped inside. Eleanor placed the pen down. At least you have learned to be useful, the dowager muttered, turning away. Do try not to look so dreary on Thursday. The bankers are important men. That gray makes you look like a corpse. Eleanor offered a perfect, shallow nod. She turned and walked out of the room, her hand brushing the silver skeleton key hidden beneath her collar. When she reached her private bedchamber, she locked the door. The room was cold, but she did not light the fire. She walked to the center of the room, where a large, flat wooden box rested on her bed. It had been delivered quietly that morning by a trusted dressmaker in the village, paid for by a small fraction of the funds Eleanor had secretly salvaged. She opened the lid. The fabric inside caught the dim light and absorbed it. Deep, rich, sapphire velvet. It was heavy, meticulously tailored, and completely devoid of the weak, blending gray she had worn for a year. It was not a dress designed for a quiet, obedient bride. It was armor. Eleanor traced the edge of the velvet with her ink-stained fingers. The quiet administrator had finished her math. On Thursday, the Duchess of Harrington would finally speak. Thursday morning arrived with a relentless, driving rain that battered the high windows of the formal dining room. The long mahogany table had been cleared of its silver centerpieces and replaced with crystal inkwells, blotting paper, and neat stacks of financial summaries. 3 representatives from the Royal Bank of London sat along one side of the table. The senior auditor, a sharp-eyed, graying man named Mr. Sterling, was quietly organizing his spectacles. Julian stood by the unlit fireplace, his jaw tight. He had not slept. His fingers compulsively opened and closed the casing of his gold pocket watch. The rhythmic ticking offered no comfort today. It only reminded him that time was slipping out from under his control. He kept glancing toward the door, dreading his wife's arrival, yet desperate to decipher the terrifying, empty calm she had weaponized against him. The Dowager Duchess Beatrice sat at the head of the table, perfectly at ease. She wore her heavy purple silk, her tortoiseshell fan resting near her hand. She smiled at the bankers, playing the role of the gracious, unbothered matriarch. The Duchess should be down momentarily with the final quarterly requisitions, the Dowager said smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. She is a quiet thing, very diligent with her little rule book, but entirely out of her depth with numbers, I am afraid. You must forgive any delays. Mr. Sterling offered a polite, non-committal nod. Julian closed his pocket watch with a sharp click. Eleanor is precisely on time, Mother, he said, his voice carrying a strange, defensive edge. He did not know why he was defending a woman who refused to speak to him, only that the thought of his mother mocking her suddenly made his blood run hot. Before the Dowager could retort, the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. The low hum of polite conversation died instantly. Julian turned, his breath catching in his throat. The hand holding his pocket watch dropped uselessly to his side. The Dowager's hand froze halfway toward her fan. Lady Eleanor Vance walked into the room. The unremarkable, faded gray ghost who had haunted the corridors for a year was gone. In her place stood the Duchess of Harrington. She wore the deep, rich sapphire velvet gown, its heavy fabric sweeping across the floor with a terrifying, absolute grace. The tailoring was severe but breathtaking, framing her pale skin and highlighting the sharp, aristocratic line of her jaw. She did not look down. She did not shrink. Her wide-set hazel eyes were focused and cold, holding the ambient light of the room and giving none of it back. But it was not just the expensive velvet that made Julian's heart hammer against his ribs. It was what rested over the fabric. Hanging from a dark ribbon around her neck, gleaming against the deep blue velvet, was the heavy silver skeleton key. She carried a massive green leather-bound master folio in her arms, with the small leather rulebook resting neatly on top. Mr. Sterling and the other bankers immediately stood up, offering deep, respectful bows. Eleanor did not offer them the shallow, submissive nod she usually gave her husband. She inclined her head with the measured authority of a queen acknowledging her court. She glided toward the table. Julian could not look away from her. The scent of the rain and something sharp, like crushed mint, followed in her wake. He felt an overwhelming urge to close the distance between them, to ask her what she was doing, to beg her to look at him. She did not. She walked past him as if he were nothing more than a shadow on the wall. Eleanor took her seat directly opposite the dowager. She placed the heavy master folio on the mahogany table with a solid, echoing thud. Beside it, she placed the rulebook. The dowager stared at the sapphire dress, her face flushing with sudden, irrational fury. "What are you wearing, Eleanor? We are conducting business, not attending a royal ball." Eleanor ignored her. She looked calmly across the table at Mr. Sterling. Her ink-stained fingers rested lightly on the cover of the green folio. "Good morning, gentlemen," Eleanor said. Her voice was soft, clear, and perfectly steady. Julian stared at her. It was the first time she had spoken in this room in an entire year. "I believe," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking onto the senior auditor, "we have some discrepancies to discuss." Eleanor opened the green leather folio. The pages inside were covered in her precise, sloping handwriting, cross-referenced with exact dates, routing numbers, and estate requisitions. "What is the meaning of this?" the dowager demanded, her voice rising sharply. She turned to Julian. "Julian, tell your wife to return to her chambers. The bank does not have time for her little household lists." Julian did not move. He did not speak. He stood frozen by the unlit hearth, his eyes locked on Eleanor's ink-stained fingers resting on the ledger. The ticking of his pocket watch seemed to echo loudly in his own ears. Eleanor did not look at the dowager. She looked only at Mr. Sterling. "On the 14th of November, Eleanor read, her voice entirely devoid of malice, delivering the words like a judge reading a finalized sentence. A requisition was signed by the Dowager Duchess for the replacement of the slate roof on the west wing. The amount claimed was £2,000. She smoothly turned a page. "There was no stonemason contracted," Eleanor continued. "The slate was never ordered. Instead, 2 days later, a bank draft for the exact sum of £2,000 was cleared through the estate's secondary account and routed to a private holding firm in London. A firm registered under the name of Lord Arthur, the dowager's nephew." The dowager's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen white. "That is a lie. She is making this up. She is a bankrupt baron's daughter who doesn't understand the first thing about estate management." Mr. Sterling leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. "May I see the page, Your Grace?" Eleanor slid the folio across the polished mahogany. Mr. Sterling looked at the numbers. His eyes widened slightly. The documentation was not just accurate, it was irrefutable. Eleanor had attached the original fraudulent repair invoices directly beside the bank's routing confirmations. "On the 3rd of February, Eleanor said, not needing the ledger to recite the numbers she had memorized in the freezing dark. £3,000 for imported timber, routed to London. On the 12th of May, £1,500 for the refurbishment of the servant quarters, routed to London." "Stop her!" the dowager shrieked, slamming her hands onto the table. The tortoiseshell fan she had wielded like a scepter for years cracked sharply against the wood, splintering down the middle. "Julian, are you going to let this peasant girl speak to me this way in our own home?" Julian stepped forward, but his legs felt like lead. He looked at the shattered fan. He looked at the trembling, furious woman who had raised him, who had convinced him that emotion was a weakness and authority was everything. She was practically vibrating with panic. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was sitting perfectly still in her sapphire velvet gown. Her posture was flawless. She had not raised her voice. She had not shown a single flicker of anger or triumph. She was simply delivering the math. "And on Tuesday of last week," Eleanor said softly, her wide-set hazel eyes finally cutting through the air to meet Julian's horrified gaze. "The most recent draft, £4,216 and 4 shillings. The number struck Julian in the chest with the force of a physical blow. He remembered his desperate anger in the morning room. He remembered demanding that she speak to him, demanding to know what she was thinking. She had told him exactly what was happening, and he had been too blind to see it. The sum was flagged as a charitable endowment, Eleanor said to the auditors, breaking her gaze with Julian. But as per the mandate of the estate rulebook, page 87, I declined to send the draft by courier, and instead bound it to this physical ledger for your direct inspection." Mr. Sterling flipped to the back of the folio. He stared at the requisition paper Eleanor had signed 2 days ago, the one the Dowager had arrogantly forced upon her. "The routing number on this draft," Mr. Sterling said, his voice grave and terribly quiet, "belongs to a known gambling syndicate in Mayfair, not a charity." The silence that followed was absolute. The driving rain against the windows sounded like applause. The Dowager Duchess sank back into her velvet chair, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The illusion of her high society superiority had been meticulously, mathematically dismantled by the woman she had ordered to remain silent. Julian stared at his wife. He had told her to manage the house flawlessly. He had told her to obey. She had done exactly that, and in doing so, she had conquered his entire world. Julian finally moved. The instinct to protect his family's name, ingrained in him since childhood, overrode his shock. He stepped away from the cold hearth, walking toward the mahogany table with the stiff, urgent gait of a man trying to stop a carriage before it went over a cliff. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said, his voice tight, lacking its usual unquestionable authority. "This is clearly a misunderstanding regarding internal estate allocations. The Harrington family will handle this privately. You may leave the ledger, and we will contact the bank in the morning." Mr. Sterling hesitated, looking between the panicked Dowager and the Duke. As a man of business, he preferred to avoid aristocratic scandals. He began to reach for the green folio. Eleanor placed her pale hand flat against the leather cover. She did not look at Julian. She kept her eyes on the senior auditor. "Page 12 of the Harrington Estate Rulebook," Eleanor said softly, the words slicing through the heavy air. "The acting Duchess must ensure the financial integrity of the household is certified by external auditors, without exception or interference. My husband was very clear on the day of our wedding. A Duchess must obey." Julian froze. The words he had used to humiliate her, to strip her of her voice and her agency, were now being repeated back to him like a legal execution. "Eleanor," Julian said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "enough." Eleanor slowly turned her head to look at him. The sapphire velvet of her gown caught the dim light, making her look ancient, untouchable, and fiercely alive. She reached up with one hand and traced the silver skeleton key resting against her collarbone. "I am merely managing the house flawlessly, Julian," she replied. Her voice held no anger. It was completely, devastatingly polite. "As you demanded." She turned back to the bankers. She reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew a single sheet of paper, pre-written in her sloping, exact hand. She slid it across the table to Mr. Sterling. As the legally recognized administrator of the household accounts, authorized by the Duke's own written mandates, I am instructing the Royal Bank of London to freeze all secondary estate accounts immediately, Eleanor stated. Furthermore, the Dowager Duchess's personal stipends are suspended, pending a full recovery of the stolen funds. No drafts bearing her signature are to be honored, ever again. "You cannot do this," the Dowager shrieked, her voice cracking into a desperate, reedy gasp. She clawed at the polished table, the broken pieces of her tortoiseshell fan scattering across the wood. "Julian, tell them. She has no authority. She is a nobody." "She has my signature, Mother," Julian said softly. The room went entirely still. The Dowager stared at her son, her chest heaving. Julian looked down at his hands. He felt entirely hollowed out. He had forced Eleanor to sign a legal contract granting her absolute administrative control over the estate, believing she would only use it to order linens and plan menus. He had built a cage of rules to keep her small, and she had quietly used those very rules to lock the doors from the inside, trapping his mother in the courtyard of her own greed. He looked at the gold pocket watch resting in his palm. The ticking felt slow, defeated. He had spent his life using his title and his rigid rules to protect himself from being vulnerable. But in his arrogance, he had handed the true power of the Harrington estate to a woman who had spent a year learning exactly how to destroy it. "The bank acknowledges your instructions, Your Grace," Mr. Sterling said quietly to Eleanor. He folded her letter and placed it into his briefcase. He did not look at the Dowager. There was no need. The older woman had shrunk in her velvet chair, suddenly looking every bit of her age, a bitter, powerless spectator in a house she no longer controlled. Eleanor stood up. The heavy sapphire velvet settled around her flawlessly. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She offered a perfect, shallow nod to the bankers. Then she picked up her silver key, letting it fall against her chest, and walked toward the door. The bankers departed with quiet, practiced efficiency, taking the green leather folio with them. Dowager Beatrice remained at the long mahogany table, her heavy purple silk suddenly looking like a shroud. She stared vacantly at the splintered remains of her tortoiseshell fan. She was a queen without a treasury, effectively exiled in the very house she had ruled with cruelty for decades. Julian did not stay to comfort his mother. The illusion of her superiority had shattered, and with it, his own. He turned and walked out of the dining room, his footsteps echoing sharply in the massive stone corridor. He found Eleanor standing by the grand entrance. The heavy double doors were open to the driving storm, the cold wind blowing mist across the ancient flagstones. She stood looking out at the rain-soaked iron gates of Harrington Manor. The sapphire velvet of her gown seemed to absorb the dim, silvery light of the storm, making her look both radiant and fiercely untouchable. The silver skeleton key rested against her chest, a permanent medal of her quiet war. "Eleanor," Julian said. She did not turn. She remained perfectly still, watching the rain wash the mud from the courtyard. He stepped closer, the cold wind biting at his face. His hand instinctively went to his waistcoat pocket. He pulled out the gold pocket watch, the symbol of his rigid control, his constant demand for her time, her silence, her absolute compliance. He looked at the engraved medal for a long second. Then, with a sudden violent motion, Julian threw it onto the stone floor. The glass shattered, the delicate gold casing dented. The rhythmic ticking, which had dictated the miserable pace of their marriage, stopped entirely. Eleanor finally turned her head. She looked down at the broken watch, and then slowly raised her wide-set hazel eyes to his face. "I do not want an administrator," Julian said, his voice cracking, stripped of all its aristocratic armor. "I do not want a flawless machine." "I was a fool, Eleanor. I was terrified of being vulnerable, so I built a prison. I thought if I demanded your obedience, I would never have to earn your respect. But you survived it. You conquered it." He took a trembling breath, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "Please, speak to me, not as a manager. Speak to me as my wife." Eleanor looked at him. There was no triumph in her expression, no cruel satisfaction. There was only a profound, ancient exhaustion, replaced quickly by the cold steel she had forged in the freezing dark of the archives. "Page 1 of the Rulebook, Julian," she said softly, her voice carrying over the sound of the falling rain. "The marriage is a transaction. I am here to fulfill a function, nothing more." "I am tearing up the Rulebook," he pleaded, taking a desperate step toward her. Eleanor raised her pale, ink-stained hand, a single, precise gesture that stopped him instantly in his tracks. "You cannot tear up the rules just because you are losing the game," she replied. She reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew the small, leather-bound book. She placed it on the marble console table near the door, right above the shattered pieces of his watch. "The Dowager is permanently removed from power," Eleanor said, her tone returning to the flawless, terrifying calm of the administrator. "The estate's finances are completely secure under my signature. The debts will be cleared. I have managed the house flawlessly, Julian, and I will continue to do so." She stepped past him, moving toward the grand, sweeping staircase. "Eleanor, wait," Julian called out, his voice raw, echoing in the empty, freezing hall. "What is left for us? If you will not be my wife, and you will not let me be your husband, what are we?" Eleanor paused on the first marble step. The heavy sapphire velvet pooled beautifully around her feet. She looked back at him over her shoulder. The storm outside cast a pale, unforgiving light across her face. "We are exactly what you asked for on our wedding day," she said quietly. "An arrangement. You have your title, and I have everything else." She turned away and walked up the stairs, her footsteps completely silent. She left the Duke of Harrington standing alone in the cold hall, staring at a broken watch, surrounded by the ruins of the authority he had once used to break her.